when my 8-year-old granddaughter deliberately poured boiling water on my arm during Sunday dinner. My son and daughter-in-law dismissed it as just a phase. But what they couldn't have anticipated was that my 40 years as a pediatric trauma nurse would help me recognize the warning signs of escalating behavior, or that Dr. Eleanor Williams, my former colleague and now Director of Family Services, would immediately validate my concerns when I called about the pattern of increasingly dangerous incidents I'd documented in my journal, leading to an intervention that ultimately saved not just my safety, but possibly my granddaughter's future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Martha Sullivan, and at 73 years old, I've learned that sometimes the most loving decision you can make is to step away when others aren't ready to face difficult truths. I spent 42 years as a pediatric trauma nurse at Riverside Memorial Hospital, where I cared for children suffering from everything from playground accidents to deliberate abuse. Those decades taught me to recognize the subtle differences between typical childhood mishaps and something more concerning, a distinction that would eventually become painfully relevant in my own family. My late husband James and I raised our only son, Christopher, in a modest colonial home in Elmwood Heights, a leafy suburb outside of Boston. James built a respected career as an architect specializing in school buildings, while I worked night shifts at the hospital, so one of us could always be home with Christopher. Our home became the gathering place for neighborhood children, holiday celebrations, and countless family milestones. I can still picture Christopher learning to ride his bicycle in our sloped driveway, James running alongside with one hand steadying the seat until that magical moment when our boy found his balance and took off on his own. Christopher was always a sensitive child, quick to tears when he fell, but equally quick to laugh once comforted. His emotional transparency was something James and I cherished, believing it would serve him well throughout life. A boy who can name his feelings will become a man who can manage them, James would say, encouraging Christopher to talk through his emotions rather than suppress them. This approach seemed to work beautifully. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Christopher maintained an open, communicative relationship with us, even during the typically turbulent adolescent period. His natural empathy and listening skills drew others to him, making him a popular friend and, later, a successful student at Northeastern University, where he studied business with a focus on pharmaceutical marketing. It was there, during his sophomore organic chemistry class, that he met Rebecca. She was strikingly beautiful, with an intensity that commanded attention. Dark hair always perfectly styled, clothes meticulously chosen, and academic performance that put her at the top of every class. When Christopher first brought her home for Thanksgiving during their sophomore year, I noticed the immediate change in my son's demeanor. His typically relaxed posture became more rigid, his natural warmth somewhat muted, as though he were performing, rather than simply being. "She challenges me to be better," he explained when I gently asked about this change. "I've never met anyone so certain about what they want from life." Rebecca was indeed certain. The daughter of a surgeon and a corporate attorney, she had mapped out her future with precision that left little room for deviation. Medical school at Johns Hopkins, residency at Mayo Clinic, and eventually, a position at a prestigious urban hospital where she could specialize in reconstructive surgery. "Life is too short to wander aimlessly," she told James and me during that first Thanksgiving dinner, her tone suggesting she found our more flexible approach to life planning somewhat deficient. My parents always emphasized having clear objectives and measurable outcomes. James, with his gentle humor, had attempted to introduce some nuance. "Sometimes the most meaningful journeys include unexpected detours," he suggested. "Some of my best architectural inspirations came from unplanned experiences." Rebecca had smiled politely but dismissed this philosophy with a quick, "Perhaps in creative fields. Medicine requires more structure." despite my private concerns about their different worldviews. Christopher and Rebecca's relationship progressed quickly. They were engaged by the end of their senior year and married shortly after graduation in a lavish ceremony that reflected Rebecca's parents' social standing rather than the more intimate gathering James and I might have envisioned. While Rebecca attended medical school, Christopher built a successful career in pharmaceutical sales that complemented her medical ambitions and allowed him to be the primary financial supporter during her training. They waited 10 years before having children, establishing their careers and purchasing a stunning modern home in Lakeshore Estates, an exclusive community with excellent schools and manicured landscapes. When their daughter, Olivia, was born, I witnessed a softening in Rebecca I hadn't seen before. She approached motherhood with the same determination she applied to her medical career, researching child development theories and creating elaborate stimulation activities for even the earliest months of Olivia's life. "She's going to have every advantage," Rebecca declared as she showed me the carefully designed sensory wall she'd created in Olivia's nursery. "The first 5 years are critical for cognitive development." I recognized in Rebecca's intensive parenting approach something of my own professional dedication, though perhaps taken to an extreme that concerned me. Every moment of Olivia's day seemed scheduled for maximum developmental benefit. Black and white flashcards during infancy, language immersion videos as a toddler, and structured educational activities that left little time for the unstructured play that my nursing background had taught me was equally essential for healthy development. James and I were delighted to become grandparents, though we sometimes worried about the pressure Rebecca's intensive parenting might place on our granddaughter. James, with his gentle humor, would often remind me to step back when I found myself concerned about their parenting choices. "Different doesn't mean wrong, Martha," he'd say. "Every generation raises children according to the best information they have at the time. Remember how your mother thought our decision to let Christopher make his own lunch choices was scandalous?" His perspective helped me maintain a supportive presence without overstepping boundaries. We settled into our roles as the grandparents who provided a slightly more relaxed environment during weekend visits, offering Olivia the simple pleasures of baking cookies without measuring the educational value of each ingredient, or exploring the garden without a structured learning objective. These moments of contrast seemed to benefit everyone. Olivia blossomed under the combination of her parents' stimulating home environment and our more relaxed approach to occasional childcare. Christopher and Rebecca appreciated the reliable support that allowed them occasional breaks from their demanding schedules. Then, when Olivia was just 3, our family equilibrium shattered. James suffered a sudden aneurysm while working in his garden. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. No warning, no chance to say goodbye. Just the abrupt end of a 47-year partnership that had defined my adult life. The grief was overwhelming. Christopher, despite his own pain, stepped up to handle funeral arrangements and practical matters, while I moved through those first weeks in a fog of disbelief. Rebecca, to her credit, set aside her typically rigid schedule to provide practical support, organizing meals and helping sort through immediate paperwork. A month after James's funeral, as I sat alone in our too-quiet house surrounded by memories, Christopher made an unexpected proposal. "Move in with us, Mom," he suggested during one of his daily check-in calls. "We have that guest house on the property that's just sitting empty. You could have your independence but be close enough that we can look out for each other." The offer was tempting. The idea of remaining in the home James and I had shared for decades suddenly felt unbearably lonely, yet moving to a retirement community seemed premature at 68. "Are you sure?" I asked cautiously. "Having your mother on the property is a big commitment, and Rebecca values her privacy." "It was actually Rebecca's idea," Christopher assured me. "She's concerned about you being alone, and frankly, Mom, we could use your help. With both our careers and Olivia's activities, we're stretched pretty thin." Rebecca confirmed this when she called the next day. "The guest house has its own entrance and garden space," she explained. You'd have complete privacy when you want it, but could join us for meals or help with Olivia when it works for everyone. It's a practical solution. Practical, I noted. Not warm or emotionally framed, but practical. Still, the arrangement made sense. I could sell our family home, invest the proceeds for additional security, and maintain independence while being part of Olivia's daily life. After careful consideration, I accepted. The first 2 years of this arrangement worked beautifully. The guest house, while smaller than my former home, provided adequate space for the furniture and mementos that mattered most to me. I joined the family for dinner several times a week, but maintained my own schedule, including volunteer work at the hospital and weekly lunches with former colleagues. I drove Olivia to her ballet and swimming lessons when her parents' schedules conflicted, and treasured the one-on-one time these drives provided. Olivia was a precocious, charming child who inherited her mother's intelligence and determination, but also displayed concerning flashes of perfectionism that sometimes resulted in disproportionate emotional responses. "It's not right," she would declare with surprising vehemence when her drawings or block constructions didn't match her vision, sometimes tearing papers to shreds or knocking towers down with deliberate force that seemed excessive for typical childhood frustration. During one such incident, when Olivia was 5, I attempted to offer perspective gleaned from decades working with children at various developmental stages. "It's okay for things not to be perfect, sweetheart," I said gently after she'd crumpled a drawing in frustrated tears. "Making mistakes is how we learn and grow." "Rebecca says excellence requires precision," she replied, using her mother's first name as she'd been taught was proper. "Mistakes are from insufficient preparation." The words, clearly echoed from overheard adult conversations, concerned me. Through my nursing career, I'd seen the damage that perfectionism and excessive pressure could inflict on children's developing sense of self. During my next private conversation with Christopher, I carefully raised the topic. "Olivia seems to struggle with self-regulation when things don't go as planned," I suggested. "It might be worth talking to her pediatrician about some simple strategies to help her manage those big emotions." Christopher's response was immediate and defensive. "She's gifted, Mom. Her teacher says she's operating 2 grade levels above her age. Kids like that are often more sensitive. Their minds work faster than their emotional development can keep up with. She'll grow out of it." Rebecca was even more dismissive when she overheard part of our conversation. My rotation in developmental? Pediatrics showed that children with exceptional intelligence often display heightened emotional responses, she stated with professional authority that brooked no disagreement. "Olivia's perfectly normal for her cognitive profile." I stepped back, respecting their parental authority while continuing to observe carefully. My decades in pediatric nursing had taught me that early intervention in behavioral concerns was far more effective than waiting until patterns became entrenched. But I also knew that unsolicited advice from grandparents, especially ones living on the property, required careful balance to avoid creating tension. As Olivia turned 7, I began noticing behaviors that triggered my professional concern more seriously. What had been tears and tantrums evolved into more calculated responses when she didn't get her way. Small acts of revenge appeared. Toys belonging to children who hadn't included her in games would mysteriously break, or food she disliked would somehow spoil before family meals. Most concerning were the incidents involving the family's aging golden retriever, Max. Twice I caught Olivia pinching the dog's ears when no one was watching, and once discovered her carefully placing small pebbles in his food bowl. When I gently asked why she was doing this, her response chilled me. "He likes Rebecca better than me," she said, her expression eerily calm. "I'm teaching him a lesson." The calculated nature of her response, delivered without remorse or recognition that she was causing pain, triggered every professional alarm bell I'd developed over 4 decades of pediatric work. This wasn't typical childhood testing of boundaries or momentary impulse control failure. This showed a concerning lack of empathy paired with deliberate intent to cause discomfort. I immediately shared my observations with Christopher and Rebecca, framing my concerns from both a grandmother's care and a professional's experience. "I'm worried about some behaviors I've noticed," I began carefully as we sat in their living room after Olivia had gone to bed. "Olivia seems to be deliberately causing discomfort to Max when she's upset, and her explanation suggests she doesn't recognize the problem with causing pain as punishment." "You're overreacting," Rebecca responded, her tone making clear she considered the matter closed. "Children experiment with power in different ways. Besides, she's under a lot of pressure with the advanced curriculum we've enrolled her in. She needs outlets for stress." Christopher, always the peacemaker, added, "She adores Max, Mom. Maybe you misinterpreted what you saw. Kids her age don't always understand how their actions affect others." Their dismissal was frustrating, but not entirely surprising. No parent wants to believe their child might have serious behavioral issues, particularly parents as invested in perfection as Christopher and Rebecca. Rather than push harder and risk damaging our relationship, I decided to document the incidents I observed, creating a journal with dates, descriptions, and context, hoping the accumulated evidence might eventually help them see the pattern I was witnessing. Over the next year, my journal filled with concerning observations: Olivia telling elaborate lies to get other children in trouble at school, small items missing from my guest house that later appeared damaged in the trash, cruel comments made to a younger child at the playground, followed by syrupy sweetness when adults turned their attention toward her. Each incident, viewed in isolation, could be explained away, and Christopher and Rebecca did exactly that whenever I raised concerns. But the pattern, viewed through the lens of my professional experience, suggested escalating issues that required intervention. My opportunity to present this accumulated evidence came after a particularly troubling incident at Olivia's 8th birthday party. One of her classmates, a quiet girl named Sophia, had received more attention than Olivia when she demonstrated an impressive gymnastics move during the garden games. Though I was serving cake and not directly involved, I observed Olivia's expression darkening as guests praised Sophia's athleticism. Later, as the children were preparing to leave, Sophia couldn't find her new charm bracelet, a birthday gift from her grandmother that she'd removed before the gymnastics demonstration. The adults helped search the party area without success, and Sophia left in tears despite Rebecca's assurances that it would surely turn up. The next morning, while helping with party cleanup, I found the bracelet buried in the garden soil, several charms broken off and apparently deliberately crushed with a rock that lay nearby. When I quietly showed Christopher, expecting him to finally recognize the seriousness of the situation, his response stunned me. "Don't say anything," he whispered, glancing toward the house to ensure Olivia wasn't within earshot. "We'll replace it and say we found it damaged accidentally. No need to make a big deal and embarrass everyone." "Christopher, this wasn't an accident," I insisted, my professional concern overriding my usual caution about parenting interference. "This is deliberate property destruction motivated by jealousy. Combined with the other incidents I've documented, it shows a pattern that needs professional attention." "Documented?" he questioned, his expression hardening. "Have you been keeping some kind of file on your granddaughter?" "I've been keeping notes because I'm concerned," I clarified. "As someone who spent 4 decades working with children in crisis, I recognize warning signs that go beyond normal development." The conversation that followed revealed the growing gulf between my professional assessment and my son's parental defensiveness. Christopher accused me of looking for problems where none existed, of applying outdated standards to normal childhood behavior, and ultimately, of betraying family loyalty by pathologizing his daughter. That evening, after Christopher had reported our conversation to Rebecca, they requested a formal family meeting in their dining room. Rebecca took the lead, her clinical detachment barely masking her anger. "We appreciate your concern for Olivia," she began, in the same tone I'd heard her, use with difficult patients. But your constant scrutiny and negative interpretation of normal childhood behaviors is becoming harmful to our family dynamic. We'd like you to stop your documentation and focus on being a supportive grandmother rather than an amateur diagnostician. Tried once more to explain the difference between typical childhood misbehavior and the concerning pattern I was observing, drawing on specific examples and my professional background. Both Christopher and Rebecca remained unmoved, attributing my concerns to a combination of outdated training, grief over James's death, and perhaps even jealousy of their parenting approach. The situation reached its breaking point 3 weeks later, during our Sunday family dinner. Rebecca had prepared an elaborate meal, as was her custom, each component precisely timed and plated with restaurant-quality presentation. Olivia had been denied a playdate that afternoon because she hadn't completed her advanced mathematics worksheets to Rebecca's satisfaction, and throughout dinner, I noticed her watching her mother with unusual intensity. When Rebecca left briefly to answer a phone call from the hospital, Olivia asked me to help her prepare the tea her mother had mentioned wanting with dessert. Always eager to encourage her participation in family contributions, I supervised as she filled the electric kettle and pressed the button to start it boiling. "I can pour it, Grandma," she insisted when the water was ready. "Rebecca says I'm old enough to help with grown-up tasks now." I hesitated, knowing that handling boiling water required careful supervision, but also mindful of not undermining her parents' judgment about her capabilities. "Let me hold the kettle with you," I suggested as a compromise. "It's very hot and could cause a serious burn." What happened next occurred with such deliberate precision that even months later, I can recall each moment in vivid detail. Olivia looked directly into my eyes with an expression I'd seen before on children in the emergency room who had acted out against parents or siblings, a calculating assessment followed by a decision. She picked up the kettle before I could reach for it and poured a stream of boiling water directly across my forearm. The pain was immediate and searing. I gasped and rushed to the sink, turning on cold water to run over the rapidly blistering skin. Through the haze of pain, what disturbed me most was Olivia's expression. Not shock or remorse, but brief satisfaction before she quickly rearranged her features into a mask of distress. "Grandma moved too close to me," she cried out as Christopher and Rebecca rushed in, alarmed by my cry of pain. "I was trying to be careful, but she bumped me." The burn was serious, a second-degree scald across 6 inches of my forearm that would ultimately require medical attention. But more alarming than the physical injury was the calculated nature of the act and the immediate, practiced deception that followed. As Rebecca applied a cooling gel and wrapped my arm, dismissing my attempts to explain what had actually happened, I heard Christopher comforting Olivia in the next room. "It's okay, sweetheart. Accidents happen, especially when you're learning new skills. Grandma will be fine." When I was finally able to speak privately with them after Olivia had been put to bed, I tried again to convey what had actually occurred. "This wasn't an accident," I explained, my nursing experience giving me vocabulary for what I needed to express. I observed deliberate intent followed by a rehearsed cover story. Combined with the patterns of behavior I've been noticing, I'm genuinely concerned about Olivia's emotional development. This isn't normal childhood exploration. This requires professional evaluation. The response I received marked a turning point in my relationship with my son and his wife. "Mother, you're overreacting," Christopher said, using my formal title in a way he hadn't since adolescence. "Olivia is just a kid. Kids have accidents. They get frustrated. They test boundaries. You of all people should understand developmental stages." Rebecca's response was even more dismissive. "Your medical training is outdated, Martha. And frankly, your generation was far too quick to pathologize normal childhood behaviors. Olivia is adjusting to the pressures of her accelerated curriculum. She doesn't need to be labeled or medicalized because of one unfortunate accident." As they continued to minimize what had happened, offering explanations that contradicted both my professional experience and what I had witnessed with my own eyes. I made a difficult decision. If I couldn't protect Olivia by staying, and couldn't protect myself from potential escalation, then perhaps my departure might finally trigger the recognition that something serious was occurring. "I'll be staying at a hotel tonight," I said, quietly once they had finished speaking. "I'll make arrangements for more permanent accommodations tomorrow." "Don't be ridiculous," Rebecca said dismissively. "You're injured. You need rest, not drama." Christopher looked shocked. "Mom, you can't be serious. Where would you even go? Your house has been sold." "I have my pension, my savings, and decades of professional contacts," I replied, the calm in my voice masking the heartbreak I felt. "But more importantly, I have an obligation to report what I've observed to people who can help Olivia get the support she needs before these behaviors become more dangerous." "Are you threatening us?" Rebecca asked, her voice cold. "I'm trying to help my granddaughter," I corrected, meeting her gaze steadily. "And sometimes help doesn't look the way we expect it to." That night, with my arm throbbing despite the medication I packed an overnight bag and called a car service. As I waited in the guest house for it to arrive, I looked through my journal of documented incidents, recognizing patterns that my professional experience couldn't allow me to ignore. This wasn't about one incident of spilled hot water. It was about a child showing escalating signs of emotional disturbance who needed intervention that her parents were not prepared to seek. Before leaving, I made one more call to Dr. Eleanor Williams, the former colleague who now directed family services at the county level. Our weekly lunch dates had kept me connected to developments in child psychology and family support services since my retirement. More importantly, Eleanor understood the difference between typical childhood behavior and warning signs that required professional intervention. "I need your guidance, Eleanor," I said when she answered, my voice finally breaking as the events of the day caught up with me. "And I think my granddaughter needs help that her parents aren't ready to provide." As the car pulled up to take me, away from what had been my home for the past 5 years, I felt both profound sadness and surprising resolution. Sometimes the most difficult decisions are also the most necessary ones. A truth I had witnessed countless times throughout my nursing career, but never expected to face so directly in my own family. The choice to leave wasn't abandonment. It was the beginning of a different kind of care, one that might ultimately matter more than my daily presence ever could. "I'll be staying at a hotel tonight," I said quietly once they had finished speaking. "I'll make arrangements for more permanent accommodations tomorrow." "Don't be ridiculous," Rebecca said dismissively. "You're injured. You need rest, not drama." Christopher looked shocked. "Mom, you can't be serious. Where would you even go? Your house has been sold." "I have my pension, my savings, and decades of professional contacts," I replied, the calm in my voice masking the heartbreak I felt. "But more importantly, I have an obligation to report what I've observed to people who can help Olivia get the support she needs before these behaviors become more dangerous." "Are you threatening us?" Rebecca asked, her voice cold. "I'm trying to help my granddaughter," I corrected, meeting her gaze steadily. "And sometimes help doesn't look the way we expect it to." That night, with my arm throbbing despite the medication I packed an overnight bag and called a car service. As I waited in the guest house for it to arrive, I looked through my journal of documented incidents, recognizing patterns that my professional experience couldn't allow me to ignore. This wasn't about one incident of spilled hot water. It was about a child showing escalating signs of emotional disturbance who needed intervention that her parents were not prepared to seek. Before leaving, I made one more call to Dr. Eleanor Williams, the former colleague who now directed family services at the county level. Our weekly lunch dates had kept me connected to developments in child psychology and family support services since my retirement. More importantly, Eleanor understood The difference between typical childhood behavior and warning signs that required professional intervention. "I need your guidance, Eleanor," I said when she answered, my voice finally breaking as the events of the day caught up with me. "And I think my granddaughter needs help that her parents aren't ready to provide." As the car pulled up to take me, away from what had been my home for the past 5 years, I felt both profound sadness and surprising resolution. Sometimes the most difficult decisions are also the most necessary ones. A truth I had witnessed countless times throughout my nursing career, but never expected to face so directly in my own family. The choice to leave wasn't abandonment. It was the beginning of a different kind of care, one that might ultimately matter more than my daily presence ever could. That first night away from my son's home was one of the most difficult of my life. The Lakeside Inn, a modest hotel about 20 minutes from Christopher's neighborhood, became my temporary sanctuary as I nursed both my physical wound and the deeper emotional injury of having my professional judgment and personal integrity dismissed so completely. After a fitful night's sleep, interrupted by pain from my burn and waves of doubt about my decision to leave, I awoke to a string of text messages from Christopher. They ranged from concerned, "Mom, please let us know you're safe," to frustrated, "This dramatic exit isn't helping anyone," to accusatory, "Rebecca thinks you're having trouble distinguishing between your patients and your granddaughter." Not once did any message acknowledge the possibility that my concerns about Olivia might be valid. I responded with a brief text confirming my safety and location, but declined his request to return immediately for a rational conversation when everyone is calmer. Experience had taught me that returning too quickly would only reinforce the idea that my concerns were emotional overreactions rather than professional assessments based on observable patterns. My first priority that morning was medical attention for my burn. Though Rebecca had applied initial first aid, the 6-inch scalded area on my forearm needed proper evaluation. The urgent care physician who examined me asked direct questions about how the injury occurred. "My 8-year-old granddaughter poured boiling water on me," I stated simply. The doctor's pen paused mid-note. "Accidentally?" The question hung in the air as I considered how to respond. As a mandated reporter herself, this physician would be obligated to report suspected child abuse. But what I was describing was something more complex. A child exhibiting concerning behaviors who needed help, not punishment. "Deliberately," I finally answered. "But the situation is complicated. I've already contacted family services about the broader pattern of behavior I've observed. This incident is part of that documentation." She nodded, understanding the professional shorthand between two healthcare workers familiar with reporting protocols. "I'll note the injury characteristics in detail," she said, photographing the burn for my medical record. "Second-degree scalding over approximately 6 inches of the forearm, with clear line demarcation suggesting directed pouring rather than splashing. Would you like me to forward this documentation to family services directly?" "Please," I replied, grateful for her matter-of-fact approach. "I have a meeting with Dr. Eleanor Williams later today. After my arm was properly treated and bandaged, I checked into a longer-stay hotel with small kitchenettes that would accommodate a few weeks' residence while I sorted out more permanent arrangements. Then I called Eleanor to confirm our meeting. Eleanor and I had maintained both professional respect and personal friendship throughout our careers. Beginning as nurses together at Riverside Memorial in the 1970s, our paths had diverged when she pursued advanced degrees in social work and psychology, eventually becoming a leading authority on family systems and child protection in our region. Now, as Director of Family Services for the county, she had both the expertise and authority to help navigate this difficult situation. We met in her office rather than our usual cafe to ensure privacy and official documentation. Though, well, into her 60s, Eleanor maintained the sharp mind and direct manner that had made her an effective advocate for children throughout her career. "Tell me everything, Martha," she said after I'd settled into the chair across from her desk, my bandaged arm a silent testament to the urgency of the situation. Start from the beginning and don't edit for my benefit. For the next 90 minutes, I detailed the progression of behaviors I'd observed in Olivia, from early concerning signs through escalating incidents, culminating in the deliberate scalding. I provided my journal documentation, including dates, specific behaviors, contexts, and responses when I'd raised concerns. I was careful to distinguish between observations and interpretations, between typical childhood development and potentially pathological patterns. Throughout my account, Eleanor took notes but asked few questions, allowing me to present the complete picture before offering any assessment. When I finally finished, she sat back in her chair, her expression grave. "What you're describing fits a concerning pattern," she acknowledged. "The progression from emotional dysregulation to calculated revenge to deliberate harm, combined with the apparent lack of empathy and sophisticated deception. These aren't typical childhood behaviors, even for gifted children under pressure." The validation from a respected professional brought unexpected tears to my eyes. After months of having my concerns dismissed as overreactions or misinterpretations, hearing someone with relevant expertise confirm my assessment was profoundly relieving. "The challenge we face," Eleanor continued, practicality taking precedence as it always had in our professional relationship, "is that intervention requires parental cooperation in cases without clear legal threshold for mandated action. What you've described is concerning, but much of it would be classified as pre-crisis, without the escalation to serious harm." "The burn was deliberate harm," I pointed out. "Yes, but directed at an adult, not self-harm or harm to a more vulnerable child, which would trigger immediate intervention protocols," she explained. "Our system, unfortunately, is designed to respond to crises rather than prevent them. That said, we have some options." Eleanor outlined a strategic approach that balanced legal requirements, therapeutic needs, and family dynamics. First, she would open an official case file documenting my report, including the medical documentation of my injury. This created a paper trail should future incidents occur. Second, she would request a wellness check by a family assessment specialist, AZE, standard protocol that Christopher and Rebecca couldn't easily refuse without raising additional concerns. The specialist will observe Olivia in the home environment and at school, using non-threatening, developmentally appropriate interaction to assess her emotional state and potential risk factors, Eleanor explained. This approach is educational, rather than accusatory, framed as support rather than investigation. Christopher and Rebecca will see through that framing immediately, I warned. They're both highly educated and vigilant about anything that might suggest imperfection in their family image. Perhaps, Eleanor acknowledged, but they're also bound by certain social and professional expectations. Rebecca, as a physician, can't easily dismiss a formal assessment request without potentially raising questions about her own judgment. The key is positioning this as routine follow-up to a reported injury involving a child rather than an investigation of the child herself. The strategy made sense, though I harbored doubts about how effectively it would penetrate the defensive barriers Christopher and Rebecca had constructed around their perception of Olivia. Still, it was a start, an official recognition that something required attention beyond my overreactive concerns. "What about my living situation?" I asked, acknowledging the practical challenges created by my departure. "I've essentially made myself homeless by leaving." Eleanor's expression softened with compassion. "That's where our personal connection rather than professional one comes in. My sister Janet has a garden apartment she rents out periodically. It's currently vacant, and I know she'd be happy to have a reliable tenant like you while you sort out longer-term arrangements." By that evening, I had moved into a small but pleasant one-bedroom apartment in Janet Williams' converted Victorian home about 30 minutes from Christopher's neighborhood. The space was furnished simply but comfortably, with a small patio overlooking a meticulously maintained garden. Janet, a retired librarian with Eleanor's direct manner but a warmer delivery, made it clear that the rental arrangement was business, rather than charity, allowing me to maintain dignity in circumstances that might otherwise have felt humiliating. "Eleanor thinks the world of you," she told me as she helped carry my suitcases in. "Says you've probably saved more children through preventive intervention than most people realize. Seems to me you're still doing that, even in retirement." Her matter-of-fact support provided unexpected comfort as I settled into this unexpected chapter of my life. While the apartment provided immediate sanctuary, I still faced the practical and emotional challenges of my abrupt departure from my previous living arrangement. Most of my possessions remained in Christopher's guest house. My car was still in his garage, and the financial arrangements for my future housing needed serious consideration. The next morning brought the first test of Eleanor's strategy. A text from Christopher informed me curtly that someone from social services had contacted them to schedule a home visit and assessment. "This is completely unnecessary and potentially damaging to Olivia," he wrote. "Is this your doing?" I took a deep breath before responding. After seeking medical attention for my burn, I consulted with appropriate professionals about the pattern of concerning behaviors I've observed. "This is standard protocol following an injury involving a child. The assessment is designed to help Olivia, not harm her." His response was immediate and angry. "We do not need strangers evaluating our daughter based on your exaggerated concerns. This stops now, or our relationship will be irreparably damaged." The threat struck deep, as it was undoubtedly intended to. Throughout Christopher's life, even during his most rebellious teenage years, our relationship had remained fundamentally solid. The possibility of permanent estrangement was painful to contemplate. Yet, my decades working with families in crisis had taught me that enabling concerning behavior patterns through silence often led to far worse outcomes than risking relationship damage through speaking difficult truths. "I understand you're angry," I replied after careful consideration. "But as someone who loves Olivia deeply, I have to prioritize her well-being over your comfort or even our relationship. The assessment is a professional courtesy that could provide valuable insights." Refusing. It won't make the concerns disappear. Christopher didn't respond further that day, but Eleanor called to inform me that despite their evident displeasure, Christopher and Rebecca had agreed to the initial assessment visit scheduled for later that week. "They're approaching it as something to be disproven rather than explored," she noted. "But at least they're allowing the process to begin." The following days established new rhythms in my temporary home. Janet proved to be a respectful neighbor who valued privacy but offered companionship when appropriate. We discovered shared interests in gardening and mystery novels, providing welcome distractions from the family situation that had upended my life. I began exploring the neighborhood, finding a small library branch within walking distance and a senior center that offered Tai Chi classes I'd always meant to try. Throughout this adjustment period, I maintained daily documentation in my journal, now expanded to include reflections on the intervention process and my own emotional responses. This practice, begun as evidence collection, had evolved into an important therapeutic tool for processing the complex mix of concern, grief, guilt, and determination that characterized this challenging time. 4 days after my departure, Christopher arrived unannounced at Janet's house. Through the front window, I saw him standing on the porch, holding a suitcase I recognized from my guest house. When I opened the door, his expression revealed a complicated mix of anger, concern, and discomfort. "Mom," he acknowledged stiffly, "I brought some of your clothes and personal items. Rebecca thought you might need them." The gesture, while practically helpful, carried undertones I immediately recognized, a demonstration that they controlled access to my possessions, and that my departure was being framed as my choice rather than a necessary response to a concerning situation. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the suitcase. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" He hesitated before stepping just inside the doorway, declining my offer to sit or accept refreshment. His body language conveyed both physical and emotional distance, arms crossed, weight shifted away from me, gaze rarely meeting mine directly. "The social worker came yesterday," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "She spoke with Olivia alone and observed her in various activities. She'll be visiting her school next week." I nodded, waiting rather than immediately responding. Throughout Christopher's childhood, I'd found that patients often elicited more complete information than direct questioning, particularly when emotions ran high. Rebecca was very unhappy about the intrusion. He continued after a moment. "She feels this creates unnecessary anxiety for Olivia and casts unfair suspicion on our parenting. The assessment isn't about assigning blame," I offered gently. "It's about understanding what Olivia might be experiencing and how to support her effectively." Christopher's carefully maintained neutral expression slipped momentarily, revealing flashes of the vulnerability I remembered from his childhood when he faced difficult situations. For a brief moment, I glimpsed uncertainty beneath his defensive posture. "What if they find something wrong with her?" he asked, his voice lower now. "What if all her special abilities and intensity that make her extraordinary get pathologized into some diagnosis that follows her forever?" The question revealed the core fear driving much of their resistance. That acknowledgement of concerning behaviors might somehow diminish the exceptional qualities they so valued in their daughter. This perspective wasn't unusual among parents of gifted children, who often feared that intervention might suppress the very characteristics they associated with their child's unique potential. "Assessment isn't about labeling or diminishing Olivia," I explained, drawing on my professional experience with similar parental concerns. "It's about understanding the full picture of who she is, both her extraordinary abilities and the areas where she might need additional support. The goal is helping her develop emotional regulation skills that match her intellectual capabilities so she can truly thrive in all areas of life." Christopher didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the floor as he processed my words. When he finally looked up, his expression had hardened again. "The social worker asked about the incident with the hot water," he said, his tone shifting back toward defensiveness. "She seemed to think there was some question about whether it was truly accidental." "I reported what I observed," I confirmed steadily. "Both the incident itself and the context of previous concerning behaviors." "She's 8 years old, Mom," Christopher said, frustration evident in his voice. 8. Kids that age don't calculate and plan the way you're suggesting. They act impulsively. They make mistakes. They don't understand consequences fully. Most 8-year-olds, yes, I agreed. But you and Rebecca have always emphasized that Olivia isn't like most children her age. Her intellectual development is advanced, and sometimes emotional development doesn't keep pace, creating exactly the concerning patterns I've observed. The logic of this perspective seemed to momentarily penetrate his defenses, but the vulnerability quickly disappeared behind renewed resistance. "Rebecca thinks you're experiencing some delayed grief reaction to Dad's death," he said, introducing a new rationalization for dismissing my concerns. "That perhaps you're projecting past trauma from your work onto Olivia because it's easier than processing your own emotions." The amateur psychoanalysis stung, particularly coming from my son, who had never shown interest in psychological frameworks before. It was clear that Rebecca had crafted this explanation, providing Christopher with yet another reason to discount my professional assessment. "I've been processing Dad's death for 5 years," I replied calmly. "And I spent 4 decades learning to distinguish between personal projection and professional observation. But I understand that considering alternative explanations for my concerns is less painful than facing the possibility that Olivia might need help." Christopher's posture stiffened further. "The social worker left her card for you," he said, placing it on the small table near the door. "She'd like to speak with you directly as part of her assessment. I've told her you're welcome to collect more of your things from the guest house when you're ready." The subtle shift from "your home" to the guest house didn't escape my notice. Linguistic distancing that paralleled the emotional barrier being constructed. As Christopher turned to leave, I felt a profound sadness for the rift that had formed between us, yet remained certain that addressing Olivia's concerning behaviors was necessary, despite the relational cost. "Christopher," I said as he reached the door. "Whatever you and Rebecca might think of my assessment, please remain open to what the professionals might observe, for Olivia's sake." He paused momentarily without turning around, his hand on the doorknob. "Goodbye, Mom," he said quietly before stepping outside, the door closing with a decisive click that seemed to underscore the distance between us. The family assessment specialist, Marianne Caldwell, contacted me later that day to arrange a meeting. We met the following morning at a quiet cafe equidistant from our respective locations, a neutral territory that avoided the power dynamics of either office spaces or private homes. Marianne was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in her mid-30s, but carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone secure in her professional expertise. After brief introductions and confirmation that we could speak privately in our corner table, she began with an approach that immediately earned my respect. "Before we discuss your observations of Olivia, Mrs. Sullivan, I'd like to understand your background more fully. Dr. Williams mentioned you have extensive pediatric experience." This professional acknowledgement of my expertise, rather than immediately positioning me as simply an anxious grandmother, established a collegial tone that allowed for more nuanced discussion. I provided a concise overview of my 42-year nursing career, including my specialization in pediatric trauma and crisis intervention. "That's helpful context," Marianne noted. "Now, could you walk me through when you first began noticing concerning behaviors, focusing initially just on observable actions rather than interpretations?" Her structured approach matched best practices for assessment interviews, establishing factual observations before exploring interpretations or emotional responses. Over the next hour, I detailed the progression of incidents I'd documented, from early emotional dysregulation through calculated revenge behaviors to the culminating hot water incident. Marianne took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions but largely allowing me to present my observations comprehensively. When I had finished, she reviewed her notes briefly before addressing the central question. "Based on your professional experience," she asked, "what specifically distinguishes these behaviors from typical developmental challenges of a gifted 8-year-old?" "Three key elements," I replied, grateful for the opportunity to frame my concerns within professional parameters. First, the calculated nature of the responses. These aren't impulsive reactions, but deliberate actions designed to cause discomfort or harm with clear awareness of potential consequences. Second, the escalating pattern, with each new boundary crossing, behavior more concerning than the last. And third, perhaps most troubling, the absence of empathic response after causing harm, combined with sophisticated deception to avoid accountability. Marianne nodded thoughtfully. "Those distinctions align with my preliminary observations as well," she acknowledged. "During my assessment yesterday, I noted several concerning interactions that corroborate aspects of your observations. Olivia shows remarkable social intelligence in many ways, but there appear to be significant gaps in empathy development and emotional regulation, particularly when her perception of status or control is threatened." This professional validation brought both relief and sadness, confirmation that my concerns weren't simply an overreaction, but also recognition that Olivia was indeed struggling with serious emotional and behavioral challenges that her parents had been unable or unwilling to acknowledge. "What happens next?" I asked, focusing on practical next steps rather than dwelling on the validation itself. "I'll complete my school observation next week," Marianne explained. "Then I'll prepare a comprehensive assessment report with recommendations. Based on what I've observed so far, those recommendations will likely include a more in-depth psychological evaluation and some form of therapeutic intervention. And if Christopher and Rebecca resist those recommendations?" I asked, voicing my primary concern. Marianne's expression became more measured. "That's where things become complicated. Without evidence of immediate danger or severe neglect, we can't mandate treatment. We can strongly recommend it, provide resources, even attach certain consequences to refusal in terms of future evaluations if new incidents occur. But ultimately, parental consent is required for most interventions. This reality, the gap between identifying concerning behaviors and securing appropriate intervention, was a familiar frustration from my years in pediatric healthcare. Many children in need of psychological or behavioral support never received it, because the system required crisis-level problems before overriding parental authority, even when pre-crisis warning signs were clearly evident. So we're essentially relying on the assessment being compelling enough to overcome their resistance, I summarized. That's part of it, Marianne agreed. But there's also the relationship component. Despite your current disagreement, you remain an important figure in their lives and in Olivia's life. Your continued advocacy, even from a distance, matters. Sometimes parents who initially resist intervention reconsider when they've had time to process the assessment and observe continued concerning behaviors themselves. Her perspective offered a framework for understanding my current painful separation from Christopher's family not as abandonment, but as a different form of advocacy, creating space for professional assessment while maintaining principled concern that might eventually contribute to necessary intervention. As our meeting concluded, Marianne asked one final question that caught me somewhat off guard. "What outcome are you hoping for from this process, Mrs. Sullivan?" The question required me to articulate goals I had felt instinctively but not explicitly defined. After a moment's reflection, I responded from both my professional experience and grandmother's heart. I want Olivia to receive the support she needs to develop healthy emotional regulation and genuine empathy before these patterns become more entrenched. I want Christopher and Rebecca to recognize that acknowledging these challenges isn't a failure of parenting, but an opportunity for more effective support. And selfishly, I suppose, I want eventual restoration of my relationship with all of them, though I recognize that may take considerable time. Marianne nodded. "Those are appropriate and realistic goals," she affirmed. "This process will likely be difficult for everyone involved, but early intervention in these patterns offers the best chance for positive outcomes. You've taken a courageous step in advocating for your granddaughter despite significant personal cost." As I walked back to Janet's house after our meeting, I reflected on this characterization of my actions as courageous. Throughout my nursing career, I had often worked with families in crisis, supporting them through difficult decisions and painful interventions. I had admired the courage of parents who sought help despite stigma or personal discomfort, who prioritized their children's needs over their own comfort or public image. I had never imagined needing to demonstrate similar courage within my own family or experiencing firsthand the painful isolation that often accompanied speaking difficult truths when others weren't ready to hear them. The personal cost was indeed significant. Loss of my home, strain on my relationship with my only child, separation from my beloved granddaughter, and the practical challenges of rebuilding life arrangements at 73. Yet beneath the why, pain and practical difficulties lay a steady certainty that I had done what was necessary. Throughout my career, I had witnessed the consequences of intervention that came too late, after concerning patterns had escalated to crisis levels. If my professional experience and personal sacrifice could help Olivia receive support before her concerning behaviors became more harmful to herself or others, then the current difficulties were a price worth paying. That evening, as I sat on the small patio of my temporary home watching dusk settle over Janet's garden, I received an unexpected text message from Rebecca. "The assessment process is proceeding as required. We request that you not contact the social worker, again without going through us first. We are Olivia's parents and will handle all professional interactions regarding her care." The message, while ostensibly about communication protocols, revealed important information. The assessment was continuing despite their evident resistance, and they felt threatened enough by my professional credibility to attempt to control my interactions with the assessment specialist. While painful, these reactions actually suggested the process was having its intended effect, creating sufficient pressure to prevent them from simply dismissing the concerns outright. Rather than engaging directly with the controlling demand, I replied simply, "I'm glad the assessment is continuing. I've already had my scheduled meeting with Ms. Caldwell and provided my documentation. I love you all and remain available whenever you're ready to talk." Setting my phone aside, I turned my attention to the small notebook where I'd been planning next steps for more permanent living arrangements. The reality that I wouldn't be returning to Christopher's guest house had fully settled in, requiring practical decisions about housing, finances, and logistics. At 73, establishing a new independent household hadn't been in my plans, but my nursing career had provided sufficient savings and pension income to manage this transition, however unexpected. 2 days later, Janet knocked on my door with news that would further shape this transition. A one-bedroom apartment had become available in her friend's senior living community about 20 minutes away. "It's not a care facility," she clarified immediately, understanding potential sensitivities. "It's independent living apartments for people over 65, with some shared amenities like gardens and a community room. Millie says they don't often have vacancies, but a resident is moving to be closer to her daughter next month." The timing seemed providential. The community, Oakwood Gardens, offered reasonable rent, a location within driving distance of Christopher's home should reconciliation eventually occur, and the practical support of age-appropriate community after years of living adjacent to a family at a very different life stage. "There's no pressure," Janet added, "but Millie could arrange a tour this week if you're interested. These units typically go quickly when they become available." I accepted the opportunity to tour the community, recognizing that whatever the outcome of the current family situation, establishing appropriate independent living arrangements represented necessary self-care rather than abandonment of hope for eventual reconciliation. The tour confirmed Oakwood Gardens as nearly ideal for my circumstances, a well-maintained community of garden apartments surrounding shared green spaces, with residents who appeared active and engaged rather than merely warehoused. The available unit, while smaller than the guest house I'd left behind, offered sufficient space for the possessions that mattered most to me, with large windows overlooking a courtyard garden where residents grew flowers and vegetables in raised beds. After reviewing the financial requirements and lease terms, I made the decision to secure the apartment, with occupancy to begin in 3 weeks when the current resident moved out. This concrete step toward establishing my new life brought unexpected emotional release, a sense of moving forward rather than merely reacting to the crisis that had precipitated my departure from Christopher's home. That weekend brought another development in the assessment process. Eleanor called to inform me that Marianne had completed her school observation and preliminary report, which had been shared with Christopher and Rebecca during a formal meeting at the Family Services office. "How did they respond?" I asked, knowing this represented a critical juncture in the intervention process. Eleanor's sigh suggested complicated news. "Mixed reactions," she reported. "The assessment validated several of your concerns, particularly regarding Olivia's limited empathic response and the calculated nature of her reactions to perceived threats to her status. Marianne recommended a comprehensive psychological evaluation, followed by appropriate therapeutic intervention. And their response to these recommendations?" Rebecca initially rejected the findings entirely, suggesting the observations were biased and the methodology flawed, Eleanor explained. She questioned Marianne's qualifications and experience with gifted children. However, Christopher showed more receptivity, particularly when Marianne framed intervention as supporting Olivia's exceptional abilities rather than correcting deficiencies. This divergent response between my son and daughter-in-law matched patterns I'd observed throughout their parenting journey, Rebecca fiercely defending their approach and Olivia's perfection, with Christopher occasionally showing openings for alternative perspectives, particularly when framed in terms of Olivia's long-term well-being rather than criticism of their parenting. The end result, Eleanor continued, is that they've agreed to a psychological evaluation with Dr. Simmons at the Children's Behavioral Health Center. He specializes in gifted children with emotional regulation challenges, which gives them a frame of reference that feels less threatening than some of the language in Marianne's report. This represented significant progress, a foot in the door toward professional intervention, even if the framing had been carefully negotiated to preserve Rebecca's sense of Olivia's exceptional status. Dr. Simmons had an excellent reputation. His involvement would ensure thorough evaluation regardless of how the referral had been framed. "Have they mentioned anything about me?" I asked, trying to gauge whether reconciliation might be on the horizon. "Not directly," Eleanor acknowledged, "but Christopher did ask whether your documentation would be shared with Dr. Simmons." Marianne explained that comprehensive evaluation typically includes information from all available sources, particularly those with extensive observation of the child in question. This indirect reference suggested Christopher at least recognized the potential value of my observations, even if he wasn't yet ready for direct reconciliation. It represented a small crack in the defensive wall that had been erected after my departure. Not reconciliation, but perhaps the beginning of a path toward it. As the call concluded, Eleanor offered perspective that helped frame this difficult period within longer trajectories of family healing. "These processes rarely follow linear paths, Martha. There are steps forward and backward, moments of insight followed by renewed resistance. The important thing is that professional intervention has begun. Whatever happens with your personal relationships, Olivia now has access to support she clearly needs." That night, I added a new section to my journal, Hopes for Olivia's Future, where I articulated the positive outcomes I envisioned beyond the current painful circumstances. I wrote about Olivia developing emotional regulation skills to match her intellectual capabilities, about her finding genuine connections with others based on empathy rather than calculation, about the possibility of her extraordinary abilities being channeled toward contribution rather than manipulation. This exercise in hope helped balance the documentation of concerns that had dominated my writing for months. Both perspectives were necessary: clear-eyed recognition of concerning patterns and hopeful vision of positive possibilities. Throughout my nursing career, I had witnessed the power of appropriate intervention to redirect concerning trajectories toward healthier outcomes, particularly when that intervention came before patterns became deeply entrenched. As I prepared for bed that night, a text message appeared from Christopher, the first direct communication since his visit to deliver my suitcase. "Olivia has appointment with specialist next week. They want your observational notes. Can drop by tomorrow to collect if convenient." The simple text from Christopher represented a hairline crack in the wall of resistance his family had built against my concerns. Not reconciliation, certainly. Not an apology, but tacit acknowledgement that my observations held value for Olivia's evaluation. I responded with equal simplicity. "I'll be home tomorrow afternoon. You're welcome any time." The next day, I prepared for Christopher's visit with mixed emotions. I organized my observation journal and made copies of the relevant entries, recognizing that relinquishing my original documentation might be necessary to maintain the fragile progress toward getting Olivia help. I also prepared a pot of coffee and Christopher's favorite oatmeal cookies, a small maternal gesture that felt both comforting and painfully nostalgic. When the doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock, I was surprised to find not just Christopher, but Olivia standing on Janet's front porch. My granddaughter wore her school uniform, pleated skirt, navy blazer with the Westfield Academy crest, and a carefully neutral expression that revealed nothing of her feelings about seeing me after nearly 3 weeks of separation. "Olivia had a half day at school," Christopher explained as I invited them in. "Rebecca thought it might be good for her to see that you're okay, since she's been asking questions." This explanation contained multiple layers of subtext. Rebecca allowing but not participating in this visit, Olivia expressing concern about me, which they couldn't easily dismiss. the implicit message that I was the one who had disrupted the relationship rather than their refusal to address concerning behaviors. "I'm glad to see you both," I said simply, focusing primarily on Olivia. "I've missed you very much." Olivia glanced at her father before responding with rehearsed politeness. "Hello, grandmother. Your arm is still bandaged." The formal address, grandmother, rather than her usual grandma, suggested parental coaching, creating emotional distance that hadn't existed before. Still, her observation about my injury showed awareness of consequences that might represent progress. "Yes, burns take time to heal properly," I replied gently. "Would you like some cookies and milk while your father and I talk?" "Janet has a beautiful garden you can see from the kitchen window." Christopher nodded permission, and Olivia followed me to the small kitchen while he remained in the living room. As I poured milk and arranged cookies on a plate, I maintained casual conversation about school and activities, careful not to create discomfort by asking direct questions about her feelings or home life. Olivia's responses were polite but measured, lacking the spontaneous enthusiasm that had characterized our interactions before the incident. When she'd settled at the kitchen table with her snack, I returned to the living room where Christopher was examining the apartment with barely concealed judgment. "It's small," he observed. "And temporary, I assume." "I'm moving to Oakwood Gardens next month," I replied, choosing directness over defensiveness. "It's a senior community with independent apartments. I've signed a 1-year lease." The information visibly startled him, concrete evidence that my departure wasn't merely a dramatic gesture, but a substantive life change. His expression shifted, from dismissive to concerned. "That seems premature," he said carefully. "Surely once this evaluation business is completed, we can discuss your returning to the guest house." The assumption that I would simply return once they'd gone through the motions of professional assessment, without meaningful acknowledgement of the concerns that precipitated my departure, revealed how differently we viewed the situation. Rather than arguing this point directly, I focused on the immediate purpose of his visit. "I've organized my observation notes," I said, indicating the folder on the coffee table. "These are copies for Dr. Simmons. I've kept the originals, which include observations dating back approximately 18 months. Christopher picked up the folder with evident discomfort. "Rebecca thinks this is excessive documentation. She says it suggests you've been looking for problems rather than simply enjoying your granddaughter." The accusation was familiar, the same reasoning they'd used to dismiss my concerns initially. Rather than becoming defensive, I drew on my professional experience to provide context. "Documentation is a professional habit from 40 years of nursing," I explained calmly. I began noting observations only when patterns emerged that concerned me based on my experience with childhood development. Most of these notes were made after I raised concerns verbally and was told I was overreacting. Christopher leafed through the pages with a deepening frown. "Some of these incidents seem so minor, taken individually." "That's precisely why documentation of patterns matters," I agreed. "Individual behaviors can often be explained as isolated events. It's the progression and escalation that signal potential concerns." He continued scanning the pages, pausing occasionally at specific entries. When he reached the documentation of incidents involving the family dog, his expression changed subtly, the first indication that some of my observations might be penetrating his defensive barrier. "I did notice Max seemed unusually skittish around Olivia recently," he admitted quietly. "Rebecca said it was probably arthritis making him sensitive to touch." This small acknowledgement, the first time Christopher had corroborated any of my observations rather than dismissing them, represented significant progress. I maintained a neutral tone rather than pressing the advantage. "The evaluation should help clarify which behaviors are within normal developmental ranges and which might benefit from additional support," I suggested. "Dr. Simmons has an excellent reputation for working with intellectually gifted children." Christopher nodded, closing the folder and placing it in his briefcase. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from defensive to cautiously inquiring. "What exactly do you think is wrong with Olivia?" The question, framed in terms of what might be wrong rather than what support might be beneficial, revealed the fear underlying their resistance. Like many parents, Christopher and Rebecca equated acknowledging developmental or behavioral concerns with labeling their child as defective or damaged. "I don't think anything is wrong with Olivia," I clarified gently. "I think she's an extraordinarily intelligent child who needs additional support, developing emotional regulation and empathy skills that match her cognitive abilities. Many exceptional children need this kind of specialized support. It's not a deficiency, but a developmental opportunity." This framing, support rather than correction, opportunity rather than deficiency, seemed to resonate more effectively than my previous attempts to communicate concerns. Christopher's posture relaxed slightly, though his expression remained guarded. Dr. Simmons said something similar when Rebecca spoke with him, he acknowledged. That many children with exceptional intellectual development benefit from additional support with social-emotional skills. We were interrupted by Olivia's return from the kitchen, her plate and glass neatly rinsed and placed in the sink, a show of responsibility that felt performed rather than natural. She stood formally beside her father, hands clasped in front of her uniform skirt. "Thank you for the cookies, grandmother," she said with practiced politeness. "They were very good," I smiled, recognizing the complex dynamics at play in this interaction. "You're very welcome, Olivia. I'm so glad you could visit today." As they prepared to leave, I handed Christopher a small gift bag I'd prepared for Olivia. "Just some books I thought you might enjoy," I explained as Olivia looked to her father for permission to accept the gift. Christopher nodded, and Olivia took the bag with a murmured, "Thank you." I had carefully selected stories featuring characters developing emotional intelligence and empathy. Not obvious moral tales that might feel preachy, but engaging narratives where understanding others' feelings proved valuable for the protagonists. At the door, Christopher hesitated before their departure. "The evaluation is scheduled for Thursday morning," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "They said it might take several sessions before they have recommendations." "That's typical for comprehensive assessment," I confirmed. "Please let me know if Dr. Simmons has any questions about my observations." Christopher nodded, still avoiding direct eye contact. "Rebecca thinks it would be better if you didn't contact Olivia directly until after the evaluation process is complete, to avoid complicating things." The restriction stung deeply. Separation from my granddaughter extended and formalized, but I recognized it as part of the complex negotiation toward intervention rather than simply punishment for raising concerns. "I understand," I replied, working to keep disappointment from my voice. "Please tell Olivia I'm thinking of her and looking forward to seeing her when it's appropriate." As they walked toward Christopher's car, Olivia glanced back once with an expression I couldn't quite read, curiosity perhaps, or confusion about the adult complexities surrounding her. I raised my hand in a small wave, which she didn't return before sliding into the back seat. The following weeks established new patterns in my life, a blend of practical preparation for my upcoming move and continued navigation of the family intervention process. I selected essential furniture from storage, donated items I no longer needed, and began organizing my remaining possessions for the transition to Oakwood Gardens. These practical tasks provided welcome structure during a period of emotional uncertainty. Janet proved a supportive presence, offering practical assistance without intrusive questions about my family situation. Her matter-of-fact approach, reminiscent of her sister Eleanor's professional manner, created space for both productivity and necessary emotional processing. Eleanor kept me informed of developments in the assessment process, maintaining appropriate professional boundaries while providing general updates. Dr. Simmons had conducted initial evaluation sessions with Olivia, including standardized assessments and observation of her interactions in structured play settings. He had requested my documentation be included in his review and had scheduled separate parent interviews with both Christopher and Rebecca. Rebecca was initially resistant to individual interviews, Eleanor reported during one of our weekly lunches. She wanted all communication to be joint sessions with Christopher present. Dr. Simmons insisted on standard protocol, which includes separate parent interviews to identify potential differences in observation or perspective. This methodical approach, following best practices despite parental resistance, reassured me that the assessment was being conducted with appropriate thoroughness. Throughout my career, I had witnessed how comprehensive evaluation processes often revealed important information that might otherwise remain hidden behind family dynamics or protective narratives. 3 weeks after Christopher's visit, as I packed the final boxes for my move to Oakwood Gardens, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Simmons himself. After introducing himself and confirming my identity, he explained the purpose of his call. "I've reviewed your observational documentation thoroughly, Mrs. Sullivan, and find it provides important historical context for behaviors I've observed during Olivia's assessment sessions. Would you be willing to meet for a brief consultation to discuss some specific incidents in greater detail?" The request suggested my observations were being taken seriously within the evaluation process, validation that provided some comfort despite the continued pain of separation from my granddaughter. "Of course," I agreed. "I'm happy to provide any information that might be helpful for Olivia's assessment." We arranged to meet the following afternoon at his office, a meeting I later learned had been approved by Christopher but not initially by Rebecca, who ultimately relented when Dr. Simmons characterized my input as standard protocol for comprehensive evaluation. The Children's Behavioral Health Center occupied a bright, modern building designed specifically for therapeutic work with young clients. The waiting area featured interactive wall panels, comfortable seating grouped for both privacy and visibility, and a carefully curated selection of books addressing various emotional and developmental challenges. Dr. Simmons greeted me with professional warmth, neither the excessive sympathy that might suggest prejudgment, nor the clinical detachment that might indicate skepticism. In his mid-50s with salt-and-pepper hair and rimless glasses, he projected the calm confidence of an experienced clinician comfortable with complex family dynamics. His office continued the center's child-friendly aesthetic while incorporating professional elements, one area arranged with small furniture and therapeutic toys for sessions with children, another with comfortable adult seating for parent consultations. He directed me to the latter area, offering water before settling into the consultation. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mrs. Sullivan," he began. "I want to be transparent about the purpose of our conversation. I've completed initial assessment sessions with Olivia and separate interviews with her parents. Your observational documentation provides a third perspective that helps establish patterns over time. I appreciated both his directness and his framing of my input as one of multiple perspectives rather than privileging any single viewpoint, an approach that demonstrated appropriate clinical objectivity. "I'm happy to clarify anything that might be helpful," I replied. "My primary concern has always been Olivia's well-being." Dr. Simmons nodded, opening a folder that contained copies of my documentation alongside his own notes. "Your observations describe a pattern of behaviors that suggest challenges with empathy development and emotional regulation, particularly in situations where Olivia experiences status threat or blocked goals. I've observed similar patterns during assessment activities, though expressed somewhat differently in the clinical setting. This professional validation, confirmation that the concerning behaviors existed beyond my perception, brought both vindication and sadness. While part of me had hoped my observations might prove overly cautious, Dr. Simmons's confirmation suggested Olivia's challenges were indeed significant enough to manifest across different environments. "Could you elaborate on specific incidents involving the family dog?" he requested. Those entries particularly stood out as potentially informative about Olivia's understanding of others' experiences of pain. For the next hour, I provided detailed context for various documented behaviors, focusing on observable actions and statements rather than interpretations. Dr. Simmons asked thoughtful, clarifying questions, particularly about Olivia's responses, when confronted about concerning behaviors and any patterns in triggers or circumstances surrounding incidents. As our consultation concluded, he shared limited but significant information about the assessment process. Based on comprehensive evaluation, including standardized measures, observational assessments, parent interviews, and your documentation, I'll be recommending therapeutic intervention focusing on emotional regulation and empathy development. I believe Olivia would benefit significantly from specialized support in these areas. Have you discussed these preliminary findings with Christopher and Rebecca? I asked, concerned about their potential resistance to recommendations. I have. A final consultation scheduled with them tomorrow, he confirmed. While I can't share their specific reactions to the assessment process, I can say that therapeutic recommendations often meet with complex initial responses from parents, particularly when children show Olivia's profile of exceptional cognitive abilities paired with specific social-emotional challenges. His diplomatic phrasing suggested continued resistance from at least one parent, likely Rebecca, while maintaining appropriate professional confidentiality. Before I left, Dr. Simmons offered one additional comment that provided hope for eventual family reconciliation. Family support systems are critical components of successful intervention for children with Olivia's profile, he noted. As we develop recommendations, I'll be discussing the importance of maintaining connections with supportive extended family members who have demonstrated understanding of her specific needs. This indirect acknowledgement of my potential positive role in Olivia's intervention plan suggested he recognized the value of my perspective and relationship with my granddaughter, even if current family dynamics had created temporary separation. 2. Days after this consultation, as I settled into my new apartment at Oakwood Gardens, Christopher called, our first direct voice conversation since my departure from their home over a month earlier. "Mom," he began, his voice carrying complex emotions I couldn't immediately identify. "We met with Dr. Simmons yesterday for his assessment results and recommendations." I remained silent, allowing him space to continue without shaping his response. Through questions. "He's recommending specialized therapy for Olivia," Christopher continued after a moment. "Something called cognitive behavioral play therapy, focusing on emotional regulation and social perspective taking. He says," his voice faltered briefly before continuing, "He says there are concerning patterns that suggest she needs significant support, developing empathy, and understanding how her actions affect others." The validation of my concerns was evident in his words, though clearly difficult for him to express. Rather than emphasizing this validation, I focused on the constructive path forward. "That kind of specialized support can be tremendously helpful," I offered gently. "Many children with exceptional intellectual abilities benefit from targeted therapy for social-emotional development." "Rebecca is struggling with the assessment," Christopher acknowledged, lowering his voice slightly as though concerned about being overheard. "She feels like they're pathologizing Olivia's intensity and ambition, but He paused again. "I recognized some of the behaviors they described from your documentation, things I'd dismissed or hadn't connected into a pattern. This admission, the first direct acknowledgement that my concerns had been valid, represented significant growth in Christopher's perspective. I kept my response measured, recognizing the courage required for this partial recognition. "It's difficult to see concerning patterns when you're immersed in daily life with a child," I said, offering understanding rather than judgment. "That's why professional assessment can be so valuable. It provides objective perspective beyond any individual's observations." Dr. Simmons also said something else, Christopher continued after a brief silence. He emphasized that Olivia needs consistent support from family members who understand her challenges and can reinforce therapeutic strategies. He specifically mentioned the importance of grandparent relationships, particularly given your background in child development. The indirect message was clear. Dr. Simmons had advocated for restoring my relationship with Olivia as part of her treatment plan, providing professional justification that could potentially overcome Rebecca's resistance. I would very much like to be part of Olivia's support system, I confirmed simply. Christopher's next words carried tentative hope for reconciliation. Rebecca has agreed that you could attend our family consultation with Dr. Simmons next week, when he'll be explaining the therapeutic approach and how family members can support it. It's Tuesday at 4, if you're available. The careful phrasing, Rebecca has agreed, rather than, we would like you to attend, revealed continuing tension in their unified front, but the invitation itself represented significant progress toward family reintegration. I'll be there, I promised. Thank you for letting me know. After ending the call, I sat in my new living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, and allowed myself to feel the complex emotions of this moment: relief that Olivia would receive, needed support, vindication that my professional concerns had been validated, sadness that the situation had required such painful separation, and cautious hope for eventual healing of family relationships. The family consultation with Dr. Simmons the following week marked a pivotal transition in our family dynamics. I arrived at the Children's Behavioral Health Center 15 minutes early, taking time to compose myself in the parking lot before entering the building. This meeting represented both professional validation of my concerns and the first potential step toward family reconciliation, a combination that created both anticipation and anxiety. In the waiting area, I found Christopher already present, sitting alone with a folder of materials on his lap. His expression when he saw me contained complex emotions, discomfort certainly, but also something that resembled relief. Mom, he acknowledged, standing awkwardly as I approached. Thank you for coming. Of course, I replied simply. How are you doing with all of this? The question, focusing on his well-being rather than my vindication, seemed to slightly ease his tension. It's been challenging, he admitted. Processing the assessment results, researching the recommended therapies, explaining to Olivia why she'll be seeing Dr. Simmons regularly. Rebecca is... He glanced toward the hallway. She's in the restroom. This has been especially difficult for her. I nodded, understanding the complex dynamics at play. For Rebecca, whose identity was so thoroughly intertwined with achievement and perfection, acknowledging her daughter needed specialized support likely represented a perceived personal failure, rather than an opportunity for growth. Before we could continue our conversation, Rebecca appeared, immaculately dressed as always, but with subtle signs of strain visible beneath her composed exterior. Slightly shadowed eyes, suggesting disturbed sleep, tension in her typically fluid movements. Martha, she acknowledged with minimal warmth. Christopher mentioned you'd be joining us. The formal distance in her greeting suggested continued resistance to my presence, though the fact that she had agreed to my attendance at all represented progress from her earlier position. I responded with professional courtesy rather than emotional engagement, recognizing that rebuilding trust would require time and consistent demonstration of my supportive intentions. Thank you for including me in this consultation, I replied simply. I appreciate the opportunity to understand how I can best support Olivia's therapeutic process. Before Rebecca could respond, Dr. Simmons appeared in the waiting area, welcoming us warmly before leading us to a conference room designed for family consultations. The space featured comfortable seating arranged for conversation rather than confrontation, with resources about various therapeutic approaches displayed on nearby shelves. I appreciate all of you coming together today, he began once we were seated. The purpose of this consultation is to review Olivia's assessment results, explain the recommended therapeutic approach, and discuss how family members can support her progress. Over the next 90 minutes, Dr. Simmons provided a comprehensive overview of Olivia's evaluation, using clear, non-judgmental language to explain both her exceptional strengths and the specific challenges identified through various assessment methods. He confirmed what I had observed: patterns of limited empathic response, calculated reactions to perceived threats to status or control, and sophisticated manipulation that exceeded typical developmental expectations for her age. Rather than framing these as character flaws or parental failures, he presented them as developmental opportunities requiring specialized support, language that seemed carefully chosen to reduce defensive responses while maintaining clinical accuracy. Olivia's profile shows significant asynchronous development, he explained. Her cognitive abilities are functioning approximately 3 years above age level, while her emotional regulation and perspective-taking skills are somewhat below age-typical development. This creates an internal disconnect that can be confusing and frustrating for Olivia herself, not just those around her. This framing, focusing on Olivia's subjective experience rather than simply the impact of her behaviors on others, seemed particularly effective in engaging Rebecca, whose defensive posture gradually relaxed as Dr. Simmons continued his explanation. The specialized therapy I'm recommending, cognitive behavioral play therapy with social perspective-taking components, is specifically designed for children with this profile, he continued. It provides structured support for developing emotional vocabulary, recognizing others' emotional states, understanding cause-effect relationships and social interactions, and building intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation for prosocial behavior. The emphasis on specialized support for Olivia's specific profile rather than fixing perceived defects seemed to further reduce parental defensiveness. Dr. Simmons then shifted to discussing family support strategies that would complement formal therapy. Consistent reinforcement of therapeutic concepts in daily life significantly improves outcomes, he explained. This means all family members understanding the core principles and using similar language and approaches when helping Olivia navigate emotional and social challenges. He turned specifically toward me at this point. Mrs. Sullivan, your background in child development provides valuable perspective that can support Olivia's progress. Additionally, grandparent relationships often create unique opportunities for practicing new skills in slightly different contexts than the primary home environment. This professional acknowledgement of my potential positive contribution, framed in terms of supporting Olivia's therapeutic progress rather than validating my previous concerns, created an opening for family reintegration that bypassed the defensive barriers established during our conflict. Dr. Simmons concluded by providing resources for all family members, books about supporting children with similar profiles, schedules for parent education sessions at the center, and specific recommendations for rebuilding family relationships strained by the assessment process. Family healing often parallels child therapeutic progress, he noted. As Olivia develops new skills for understanding others' perspectives and regulating her emotional responses, family members may similarly benefit from practicing these skills in their interactions with each other. The gentle suggestion that all family members, not just Olivia, might benefit from improved perspective-taking and emotional regulation, landed with subtle but noticeable impact. Christopher nodded thoughtfully, while Rebecca's expression suggested reluctant consideration rather than outright rejection. As the consultation concluded, Dr. Simmons invited questions from each of us. I kept mine focused entirely on how I could best support Olivia's therapeutic process, rather than seeking additional validation of my initial concerns. This forward-looking approach seemed to further ease tensions, particularly with Rebecca, whose final question revealed unexpected vulnerability. "How do we explain this to others?" she asked quietly. "To family, teachers, her friends' parents, without creating a label that follows her." The question revealed one of her core fears, that acknowledging Olivia's challenges might diminish how others perceived her exceptional qualities or create limiting expectations that would constrain her future opportunities. Dr. Simmons addressed this concern with compassionate practicality. I recommend simple, matter-of-fact language focusing on skills development rather than diagnosis or deficits. Something like, Olivia is working with a specialist on emotional regulation techniques that help her channel her exceptional abilities more effectively. Most people respond well to this framing, recognizing it as responsible parenting rather than an indication of serious problems. His response seemed to ease some of Rebecca's tension, offering language that acknowledged Olivia's challenges while maintaining the narrative of exceptional ability that was so important to her self-concept as a parent. As we gathered our materials to leave, Christopher surprised me with a direct invitation. "Would you like to join us for dinner this Saturday, Mom? We thought it might be good for Olivia to reconnect with you before she begins therapy next week." Dr. Simmons suggested familiar, supportive relationships would help her feel secure during this transition. The invitation, clearly influenced by therapeutic recommendations but nonetheless representing significant progress toward reconciliation, brought unexpected emotion that I worked to contain in the professional setting. "I would like that very much," I replied simply. "Thank you." Rebecca didn't echo the invitation but nodded slightly, her expression suggesting reluctant acceptance rather than enthusiasm. Still, her willingness to include me in family dinner represented substantial movement from her previous position of complete exclusion. As we walked toward the parking area, Christopher fell into step beside me while Rebecca moved ahead to the car. In this brief moment of privacy, he spoke in a lower voice. "I owe you an apology, Mom," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I dismissed your concerns when I should have listened more carefully. He hesitated, searching for words. "I was protecting my image of our perfect family rather than protecting Olivia herself." The acknowledgement, partial but sincere, represented important growth in his understanding of the dynamics that had led to our painful separation. Rather than emphasizing my vindication, I focused on the path forward. "We all want what's best for Olivia," I replied gently. "Now we have better information and resources to help her develop the skills she needs. That's what matters most." Christopher nodded, glancing toward Rebecca waiting at their car. "Saturday at 6? He confirmed. "Olivia will be glad to see you." "I'll be there," I promised. As I drove back to my new apartment at Oakwood Gardens, I reflected on the long, painful journey from identifying concerning behaviors to securing appropriate intervention for my granddaughter. The personal cost had been significant: temporary loss of my relationship with Olivia, strain with my only child, departure from my home, and the necessity of rebuilding independent living arrangements at 73. Yet the ultimate outcome validated the difficult choices I had made. Olivia would receive the specialized support she needed to develop crucial emotional and social skills before her concerning behaviors became more entrenched or harmful. Christopher had begun acknowledging the validity of my observations, opening the possibility for restored trust in our relationship. Even Rebecca, though still resistant, had accepted professional assessment and recommendations that would benefit her daughter. My new apartment at Oakwood Gardens would never replace the guest house where I had expected to spend my later years, close to family and integrated into daily life with my granddaughter. But it offered independence, community, and the dignity of having stood firmly for what I knew to be true, despite significant pressure to remain silent. As I began preparing a small housewarming gathering for the new friends I'd made at Oakwood Gardens, including Janet and Eleanor, who had provided such valuable support during the crisis period, I reflected on what this experience had taught me about both professional and personal courage. Throughout my nursing career, I had advocated for countless children, using my training and observation skills to identify concerns that might otherwise have been missed or dismissed. I never expected to need that same professional courage within my own family. or to experience firsthand the painful isolation that often accompanies speaking difficult truths when others aren't ready to hear them. The experience had given me new empathy for parents I had worked with throughout my career who struggled to acknowledge concerning patterns in their children's development, not because they didn't care, but because caring so deeply made acceptance so much harder. The day before my planned family dinner with Christopher, Rebecca, and Olivia, I received a handwritten note delivered by mail, unusual in our era of texts and emails. The envelope contained a simple card with Olivia's distinctive handwriting inside. "Dear Grandma, not grandmother, Dad says you're coming for dinner tomorrow. I have a new book to show you. Dr. Simmons says it's about feelings and other people's perspectives. Some parts are interesting. I'm sorry about your arm. I was very angry that day. Olivia." The note, clearly written without parental editing given, its direct acknowledgement of responsibility for my injury, brought tears to my eyes. It represented the first indication that therapeutic conversations were already having impact, creating space for Olivia to recognize the effects of her actions on others. The road ahead would undoubtedly include challenges. Therapeutic progress rarely follows linear trajectories, family healing takes time, and Rebecca's resistance might continue to create complicated dynamics. But this small note represented the beginning of the outcome I had hoped for when I made the difficult decision to leave. Not just professional validation of my concerns, but actual help for my granddaughter in developing the emotional and social skills she would need for genuine connection and well-being throughout her life. Sometimes love requires standing firm rather than standing by, advocating for necessary help even when that advocacy carries personal cost. As a pediatric nurse, I had always known this truth professionally. Now, as a grandmother who had risked relationship rupture to secure needed support for a beloved child, I understood it in a profoundly personal way. The most loving acts aren't always recognized as such in the moment they occur. Sometimes they appear as unwelcome intrusions, uncomfortable truths, or painful separations. But with time and appropriate intervention, they reveal their true nature. Not abandonment, but advocacy. Not criticism, but care. Not rejection, but the deepest form of love. The willingness to endure personal pain to secure another's well-being. I placed Olivia's note carefully on my refrigerator door, the first decoration in my new home. I felt cautious hope for the journey ahead. Not a perfect resolution, but a beginning of something better for all of us, especially for the remarkable, complicated granddaughter whose well-being had been worth every difficult choice along the way. 6 months after Olivia began therapy, I sat on a bench at Riverside Park watching my granddaughter carefully explain the rules of her new board game to another child. The spring afternoon was perfect. Warm sunshine, flowering trees, and the subtle but significant changes in Olivia that only someone who had known her before would fully appreciate. "You can go first if you want," she offered the younger boy, a courtesy that would have been unthinkable half a year ago when winning at all costs dominated her interactions with peers. From my position several yards away, close enough to supervise, but distant enough to allow genuine social interaction, I observed the small miracles of progress that Dr. Simmons had helped create. Olivia still occasionally stiffened when things didn't go her way, but now she used the breathing techniques and self-talk strategies she'd learned in therapy to regulate her response rather than lashing out. "That was a good move," she acknowledged, when her playmate made a strategic choice that challenged her position. The comment wasn't entirely natural yet. There was still a deliberate quality to her pro-social behaviors, but the effort itself represented tremendous growth. "She's applying the perspective-taking exercises consistently now," Rebecca commented, surprising me by taking a seat beside me on the bench. These moments of collaborative observation had become more frequent in recent months, though still punctuated by occasional tension when Rebecca felt scrutinized or judged. "I noticed," I agreed simply. "She seems to be internalizing the skills rather than just performing them." Rebecca nodded, her gaze fixed on her daughter rather than meeting my eyes, a habit that persisted during our more vulnerable conversations. Dr. Simmons says she's making exceptional progress. Apparently, some children with similar profiles take years to develop the emotional regulation strategies she's mastered in months. The pride in her voice represented its own kind of progress, finding value in Olivia's emotional development, rather than measuring worth exclusively through academic achievements or competitive victories. Our relationship remained a work in progress, complex, sometimes strained, but gradually evolving into something that prioritized Olivia's well-being over past grievances. The weekly family therapy sessions that complemented Olivia's individual treatment had created structured opportunities to address the damage done by months of dismissed concerns and defensive reactions. She asked me something interesting this morning, Rebecca continued after a moment of silence. She wanted to know if I ever find it hard to say I'm sorry when I make a mistake. The question reflected Olivia's current therapeutic focus on accountability, recognizing the impact of her actions on others, and taking responsibility without excessive shame or defensive deflection. "What did you tell her?" I asked, genuinely, curious about Rebecca's response to this probing question that mirrored challenges in our own relationship. Rebecca's smile held a hint of self-awareness that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. I told her the truth, that it's one of the hardest things for me to do, especially when I've tried so hard to get everything right. But that I'm practicing, just like she is. This small acknowledgement, that she too struggled with the very skills Olivia was working to develop, represented significant growth in Rebecca's own emotional awareness. The family therapy sessions had gradually revealed how Rebecca's perfectionistic standards had shaped Olivia's understanding of acceptable behavior and emotional expression. Dr. Simmons had skillfully helped her recognize these patterns without inducing paralyzing guilt or shame. "We're all practicing," I offered gently, including myself in this ongoing work of development rather than positioning myself as having already arrived. The restored relationship with my granddaughter had taken shape gradually over the past months. Initial supervised visits had evolved into regular involvement in Olivia's life, though I remained in my apartment at Oakwood Gardens rather than returning to the guest house. This arrangement, independent living with frequent family interaction, had ultimately proven healthier for everyone involved, creating appropriate boundaries while maintaining meaningful connection. My new home had become a special place for Olivia, who visited every Saturday afternoon while her parents attended their own therapy session, a standing arrangement that benefited everyone. For Olivia, these visits provided opportunities to practice new social-emotional skills in a supportive environment. For Christopher and Rebecca, they offered valuable time to work on their own relationship. And for me, they restored the precious grandmother-granddaughter bond that had been temporarily severed. "Grandmother, Lucas wants to see my rock collection. Can I show him the ones at your apartment next Saturday?" Olivia called from the playground, her excitement evident in her voice. The title, Grandmother, once imposed as a formal distance marker, had been reclaimed by Olivia herself as a special designation rather than the casual grandma she used before. "That's what I call you because you're not like other grandmas," she had explained matter-of-factly. "You're a grandmother who knows important things and helps people learn them." The term had evolved from Rebecca's attempt to create distance into Olivia's expression of unique respect. "Of course," I called back. "We can add the new specimens you found at the Science Center." As Olivia returned to her game, Rebecca shifted slightly on the bench, her posture suggesting she had something more significant to discuss. "Christopher and I have been talking," she began, her voice carefully measured, "about the summer programming. For Olivia, Dr. Simmons suggested balancing academic enrichment with opportunities for social-emotional development." I nodded, waiting for her to continue rather than offering immediate input. Our most productive conversations occurred when I maintained this careful balance, available for consultation without overstepping boundaries that remained somewhat sensitive. "We're considering the Riverside Summer Program," rather than the academic. Intensive at Westfield, she continued, referring to the highly competitive academic camp that had been their original plan. Riverside has more mixed ability groupings and emphasizes collaborative projects alongside academic content. This shift in priority, valuing collaborative skills alongside academic achievement, represented significant evolution in their parenting approach. 6 months earlier, Rebecca would have dismissed such a program as insufficiently rigorous for Olivia's intellectual capabilities. "That sounds like a thoughtful balance," I offered. Olivia mentioned enjoying the group science projects they've been doing at school. Rebecca nodded, then hesitated before adding, "We thought, perhaps you might be willing to take her on Thursdays during the program. They have community connection days where family members with relevant professional experience can contribute. Your background in child development would be valuable, and it would give you regular time with Olivia." The invitation to participate officially in Olivia's summer experience, rather than merely visiting during designated family time, represented a significant step in rebuilding trust. It acknowledged the value of my professional background rather than dismissing it as outdated or irrelevant. "I'd be honored to participate," I replied simply, containing the emotion this milestone invitation evoked. Our conversation was interrupted by Christopher joining us, returning from a work call with coffee for each of us. A small but meaningful gesture of inclusion. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his glance between Rebecca and me suggesting awareness of the sometimes delicate nature of our direct interactions. "Mom's agreed to take Olivia on Thursdays for the Riverside program," Rebecca informed him, accepting her coffee with a murmured thanks. Christopher's smile reflected genuine pleasure at this arrangement. "Excellent. Olivia will be thrilled." In the months since Olivia's initial assessment, Christopher had gradually shifted from defensive middleman to active advocate for healthy family functioning. His individual therapy, initially suggested as support during Olivia's treatment, but eventually embraced as valuable in its own right, had helped him recognize patterns of conflict avoidance that had enabled concerning situations to escalate unnecessarily. "How's the new resident getting along?" he asked, referring to my recent election to the Oakwood Gardens Community Council, a role that reflected my growing integration into my new home environment. "Still finding her way," I replied with a smile. "But enjoying the challenge." The position had come as a surprise nomination from neighbors who valued my organizational skills and health background. The responsibility had provided unexpected purpose during this life transition, allowing me to contribute meaningfully to my community while maintaining appropriate boundaries with my family, a balance that had proven healthier than my previous role as live-in grandmother. As we watched Olivia navigate a minor disagreement with her playmate, using words rather than manipulation to express her perspective, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The painful incident that precipitated my departure from Christopher's home had ultimately led to necessary intervention for Olivia, healthier family dynamics for all of us, and personal growth I wouldn't have anticipated at 73. Dr. Simmons had noted in our most recent family session that crisis often reveals truths that remain hidden during comfortable periods. The hot water incident didn't create problems that weren't already present, he had observed. It simply made them impossible to ignore any longer. That painful moment, a child deliberately causing harm and adults refusing to recognize the seriousness of the action, had required me to make the most difficult decision of my life: to walk away from my home and family, rather than remain silent about concerning patterns that threatened my granddaughter's development and potentially the safety of others. The professional courage I had developed over decades of nursing had ultimately served a purpose I never anticipated, providing strength to stand firm when my personal courage might have faltered in the face of rejection and dismissal from those I loved most. "Grandmother, watch this," Olivia called, demonstrating a complicated jumping pattern she had created with her playmate. I waved acknowledgement, catching Christopher's smile at her enthusiasm. "She's going to be okay," isn't she?" he asked quietly, the question carrying echoes of the fear that had initially driven their resistance to intervention. "She already is okay," I replied gently. "And now she's developing the skills to stay that way, even when things get difficult." That evening, as I prepared dinner in my apartment, a simple meal for myself after a full day with family, I noticed Olivia's latest artwork displayed on my refrigerator. Unlike her earlier perfectionist creations that often ended in tears and crumpled paper when they didn't meet impossible standards, this drawing showed evidence of mistakes that had been incorporated into the design rather than rejected outright. The bottom, in her increasingly confident handwriting, she had written, "For grandmother, who helped me learn important things. Love, Olivia." The simple dedication represented everything I had hoped for when I made the painful decision to leave rather than remain silent. Not vindication or victory, but a child receiving the support she needed to develop healthy emotional skills alongside her remarkable intellectual abilities. Sometimes love looks like walking away when staying would enable harmful patterns to continue unchallenged. Sometimes the most important advocacy happens when we stand firm in difficult truths rather than settling for comfortable silence. And sometimes the greatest validation comes not in being proven right, but in witnessing positive change that might never have occurred without the courage to speak up, even at significant personal cost. As I traced my finger over Olivia's handwritten note, I felt profound gratitude for the full circle our journey had traveled, from crisis to healing, from rejection to reconciliation, from concern to intervention, and most importantly, from potential harm to genuine growth for the granddaughter, whose well-being had been worth every difficult choice along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.